Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
It's good to be here for this one.
Yeah, today we're undertaking a deep dive into a profoundly challenging piece of source material.
Very challenging, yeah.
We are looking at Harriet A. Washington's groundbreaking work, Medical Apartheid. And, for anyone listening who thinks they know the history of medicine, like maybe you've heard of the Tuskegee experiments or early surgical practices.
This is going to fundamentally shift how you look at the entire institution of healthcare.
Exactly. But before we get into the heavy specifics, we need to lay out exactly what we are and what we're not doing here today.
That is a crucial place to start. Because the instinct, when you're presented with the sheer scope of what Washington has uncovered, is to just treat this like a traditional historical review.
Right, like a recap.
But I want to clarify our mission to you, the listener, right from the opening minute. This is not a book review.
No.
Nor are we simply going to sit here and read off a chronological list of historical and medical scandals.
Treating them as isolated, unfortunate tragedies from a bygone era.
Exactly. What we are doing today is a rigorous institutional systems analysis.
And I want to pause right there because systems analysis sounds a bit academic. What does that actually mean for the conversation we're about to have?
It means we are looking at the medical research and care apparatus not as a collection of individual doctors making individual choices, but as a machine.
A machine operating under racialized power.
Yes. The primary system under examination today is how that architecture functions. We are going to explore exactly how human bodies are selected to bear the extreme risks of early experimentation.
How consent is systematically managed, manipulated, or just entirely bypassed.
We'll examine how institutional prestige and hero narratives protect the system from public scrutiny.
And ultimately, how that harm is reproduced across generations.
Which is vital to understand.
And just to be totally clear up front, we are navigating some heavily charged historical and political territory here.
We certainly are.
So our goal isn't to take any political sides, right-wing or left-wing. We are impartially reporting on Washington's analysis. We're just conveying the ideas and the systems-level framework contained in the source material.
We aren't looking for personal villains. We're looking at the blueprint.
Looking at a system that extracts data and utility from the vulnerable to benefit those with power.
Precisely.
All right, so here is the roadmap for you as we navigate this deep dive. We are going to build this layer by layer. We'll start with the design, the actual architecture of this extraction.
Then we'll move to the incentives, looking at how the system actively rewards discovery while completely externalizing the harm.
From there, we will trace the outcomes. And we're going to move way beyond just physical damage to talk about the social reality of rational mistrust.
Next is persistence, the feedback loops and bureaucratic reinforcements that keep the system running today.
And finally, interconnection, where we nest this medical system within the larger forces of history, capitalism, and public health.
It's a heavy journey. I won't sugarcoat that. But to understand modern disparities in health, to truly grasp why different communities experience the exact same hospital in vastly different ways, you absolutely have to understand the blueprint.
So let's jump right into the foundation of that blueprint. Part 1, design, the architecture of extraction.
When we normally think about healthcare, the structural roles seem pretty straightforward.
Right. You have a doctor and you have a patient. The patient is sick, the doctor tries to heal them.
But when we analyze this as an institutional system, those roles fracture into something much more complex. We have to identify the real key players here.
The researchers, the physicians, the hospitals.
The medical schools, the funders.
Professional associations, and the state itself.
And the moment you introduce those institutional layers, you have to completely reevaluate the terminology you use.
Because research subject and patient are presented to us as neutral terms.
We think of them as biological or purely clinical categories. But in the context of the system Washington describes, they are not neutral at all.
They are institutionally assigned roles.
Yes. And they are dictated by social hierarchy, by coercion, and by dependency.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener. What is the functional difference, systemically speaking, between a patient and a research subject?
It comes down to who actually benefits from the medical encounter. A patient is someone who receives care for their own direct benefit.
The doctor's primary goal is the health of that specific individual in the bed.
Right. A research subject, however, especially historically speaking, was treated as raw material.
utilized to advance a scientific theory.
Or to perfect a surgical technique for the eventual benefit of someone else.
And the source material provides a deeply uncomfortable historical origin point for this dynamic. It takes us back to the antebellum South.
Because under chattel slavery, the concept of a black patient practically didn't exist in the eyes of the medical establishment.
Enslaved individuals could not legally consent to anything. They couldn't consent to labor, to marriage.
And they certainly couldn't consent to medical treatment or experimentation. The legal owner consented for them.
Which meant that from the very inception of organized American medicine, black individuals were literally designated in medical literature as clinical material.
Not patients. Material.
That phrase, clinical material, it just strips the humanity right out of the equation. But why was there such a sudden, massive demand for this material in the first place?
To understand that, you have to look at the massive shift in how medical education was designed in the early 19th century.
The rise of the Paris School of Medicine.
Or the hospital movement. Before this movement, if you wanted to be a doctor, your training was largely theoretical.
You sat in a room, you memorized ancient texts from Galen, you learned about balancing the four humors.
And you maybe watched a senior professor examine someone. It was very hands-off.
It was philosophy with a stethoscope.
Exactly. But the Paris School revolutionized this. They argued that to truly understand the human body and disease, you had to get your hands dirty.
You needed hands-on clinical practice, observation of disease in living people, and anatomical dissection of the dead.
Medicine shifted from being an observational philosophy to an empirical surgical science.
But to do empirical surgical science, you need bodies. You need a lot of bodies to practice on before you get good at it.
You need an endless supply. In Europe, this led to rampant grave robbing and the exploitation of the destitute in charity wards.
But in the American South, the social reality of slavery provided a unique, legally protected, and vast population to fill that exact need.
The system didn't have to skulk around graveyards at midnight. It had an institutionalized supply of unprotected human beings.
And Washington uncovers evidence of this that is just staggering to read. We aren't talking about secretive back alley deals here.
Not at all. Southern medical schools, institutions like the Medical College of South Carolina and the Atlanta Medical College,
They were literally placing advertisements in public newspapers.
read the mechanics of those advertisements because they perfectly illustrate the design of the system.
The ads were directed at slave owners. The medical schools were asking the owners to send their sick or aged or defective slaves to the medical college for free treatment.
But they didn't hide their motives.
No, they openly stated in these circulars that their sole object in offering this free boarding and care was to collect interesting medical cases for student instruction and for surgical practice.
Just think about that transaction happening there. The medical school gets living bodies for their young students to practice cutting into,
And the slave owner gets rid of a sick laborer they don't want to pay to feed.
with the outside chance that the free surgery might restore the enslaved person's labor value.
At no point in that transaction is the actual human being on the operating table consulted.
It's the design operating exactly as intended.
They were building facilities, specific hospital wings, explicitly to house black individuals. And we need to be clear, this wasn't born out of some progressive desire for equitable public health.
It was a warehousing strategy to ensure a steady, reliable supply of clinical material for the semester.
Even the charity wards for poor whites and free black people functioned on a similar unwritten rule. The price of admission to get a bed and a meal was submitting yourself to observation, prodding, and experimentation by a dozen medical students.
Which brings us to the core, foundational contradiction of this entire architectural design, the illusion of scientific neutrality.
Right, because the medical establishment always wraps itself in this cloak of universal objectivity. We are men of science, driven only by the universal benefit of mankind.
They claimed scientific neutrality while simultaneously relying on a system of completely unequal exposure to risk.
And unequal access to benefit.
Yes. This creates a paradox that exposes the intellectual contortions of the system. Let's look at how they justified slavery medically.
Many of the most prominent physicians of this era were the leading architects of scientific racism.
They wrote entire treatises arguing that black bodies were biologically fundamentally different from white bodies.
They claimed they had different nervous systems, that their blood was different, their brain structures were smaller.
That their pain tolerances were completely alien. They generated reams of pseudoscience because it was politically necessary.
Right, to maintain a brutal race-based system of chattel slavery. In a country that claims to believe in inalienable rights, you need the authority of science to say, no, these people are biologically distinct and suited for this labor.
But, and this is the massive, glaring, logical hole that Washington points out, if you genuinely believe, as a man of science, that black bodies are biologically vastly different from white bodies.
Why are you exclusively using black bodies to test, practice, and perfect surgeries that you intend to use to cure white people?
That is the paradox that breaks the system's own internal logic. If the nervous system is completely different, how could an experiment on a black person yield reliable, actionable data for a white patient?
It makes no scientific sense. It proves the whole biological difference argument was a sham.
It was a political rationalization masquerading as a scientific reality. The doctors knew on a practical, anatomical level that human physiology was shared.
A liver is a liver. A fistula is a fistula.
That is precisely why they used black bodies to perfect their techniques. They needed the biological similarity to make the practice valid.
But they maintained the fiction of fundamental difference to justify the social extraction.
It allowed the medical system to claim it was doing objective science while completely violating the basic ethical principle of equal protection.
This naturally leads us to ask, why do it? Why go through these mental gymnastics? If you have a system functioning like this, what is the engine driving the behavior?
And that brings us to the second major framework of our analysis: incentives.
We need to look at how the system actively rewards discovery while completely externalizing the harm.
If you want to understand any complex system, you don't look at its PR statements. You look at its incentive structures. You look at what it actively rewards.
So what is the currency of the medical research apparatus?
It isn't just money, though capital is always a factor. The currency is professional advancement.
It is getting published in prestigious medical journals.
Yeah.
Securing massive institutional funding.
Tenure at a major university. And ultimately, it's about historical immortality.
The system is designed from the ground up to reward discovery. It rewards the person who refines a new surgical technique or isolates a new compound.
And the system does not particularly care, structurally speaking, about the collateral damage required to achieve that discovery.
As long as that damage is kept out of sight or inflicted on a population that society has deemed expendable.
There is no historical figure who embodies this specific incentive structure more perfectly or more horrifyingly than J. Marion Sims.
If you open a medical textbook today, Sims is often still referred to as the father of American gynecology.
But when you apply a systems-level analysis to the primary sources, it becomes impossible to view him as a lone, benevolent genius.
He is the ultimate predictable output of this incentive structure.
We have to look at the exact mechanism of his success, which is inextricably tied to the total subjugation of black women.
Let's provide some context for the listener. Sims was attempting to cure a condition called a vescovaginal fistula.
Let's explain what that is, because the reality is it is devastating. A fistula, in this context, is an abnormal tear or opening between the bladder and the vagina, or the rectum and the vagina.
Historically, it was a catastrophic complication of prolonged, obstructed childbirth.
Before modern obstetrics and C-sections, a woman could be in labor for days. The pressure of the baby's head against the pelvis would cut off blood flow to the soft tissues,
causing that tissue to die and slough away, leaving a hole. And the result is constant, uncontrollable incontinence.
It left women in constant pain, prone to severe infections, and functionally ostracized from society.
It was considered an unsolvable medical puzzle. Surgeons had tried to close these fistulas for centuries and failed.
Because the area is incredibly difficult to access and keep sterile, and the sutures of the time would just cause worse infections.
So solving this puzzle was the golden ticket. Whoever figured out how to surgically repair a fistula was going to be famous. That's the incentive.
Now let's look at how Sims achieved it. He essentially created a backyard hospital on his property in Montgomery, Alabama.
And to get his clinical material, he bought or leased several enslaved women who suffered from fistulas. The historical records, heavily driven by Sims's own journals, name 3 of them.
Betsy, Anarcha, and Lucy. There were others, but those are the names we know.
And we must be unflinching when we examine the mechanism of this research. Because Sims was essentially flying blind, experimenting with different techniques, different surgical positions, and different suturing materials.
He operated on these women repeatedly. He performed over 30 surgeries on Anarcha alone over a period of about 4 years.
30 surgeries in the mid-1800s. And we need to be crystal clear about what that means. This is before the adoption of general anesthesia.
These were excruciating, invasive procedures performed on fully conscious women.
And this presents a mechanical problem for a surgeon. A patient in that level of agony is going to thrash, they're going to scream, they're going to physically resist the knife.
Sims needed behavioral compliance. He needed them to hold still.
And the sources detail how he achieved that compliance. It wasn't through gentle bedside manner. He kept these women addicted to heavy doses of opium and morphine.
And as Washington's analysis points out, this wasn't administered primarily as compassionate pain relief.
The dosages and timing suggest it was used to induce a chemical dependency and a physical lethargy that weakened their will and ability to resist the repeated, agonizing procedures.
He kept them captive, he addicted them to narcotics, and he sliced into them over and over again until he finally perfected the technique.
Which ultimately involved using fine silver wire for the sutures, which didn't cause the massive infections that silk or catgut did.
So he solves the puzzle. He cracks the code. Now we have to look at the reward. What happens when a doctor fulfills the system's incentives?
Does the system punish him for the torture of Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy?
The exact opposite. Once the technique was perfected on the bodies of enslaved women, Sims packed up and moved to New York.
He opened the Women's Hospital of the state of New York, the very first hospital dedicated entirely to women's medicine.
But he wasn't treating enslaved women there. He was treating wealthy, white, high society women who could pay handsomely for the cure he developed in Alabama.
He became an international superstar. He traveled to Europe, performed surgeries for French royalty, and was eventually elected president of the American Medical Association.
The system showered him with wealth and prestige. They literally cast him in bronze.
Statues were erected in his honor across the country, most notably right in Central Park in New York City, where he stood for over a century looking heroic.
This is why the systems level analysis is so vital. It is incredibly easy and emotionally satisfying to look at J. Marion Sims and label him a monster.
To call him a mad scientist or a personal villain.
But doing that lets the system off the hook. If we just say Sims was an evil man, we ignore the fact that Sims was not a rogue actor deviating from the norms of his profession.
He was the system functioning flawlessly.
The system dangled the reward of prestige for a surgical breakthrough. Sims utilized the socially accepted extraction of black bodies to achieve it.
The system then rewarded his refinement of technique while completely externalizing the agonizing physical and psychological costs onto marginalized women.
Women who had absolutely no power to refuse, no legal standing to sue, and no platform to generate public outrage.
But how do people live with themselves? Doctors take oaths. To make a system like this work without tearing itself apart morally, there has to be a psychological buffer.
How do practitioners of this system justify these actions to themselves? They rely on rationalization layers.
And the most powerful rationalization layer available to them was the scientific racism we touched on earlier.
This ideology acts as a lubricant. It reduces the moral friction for the practitioners.
If you are a doctor and you truly structurally believe that the subject of your experiment is a lesser being who does not experience the world the way you do,
it becomes infinitely easier to slice into them without anesthesia.
The quotes from the medical journals of the time are just chilling. They weren't whispering this in private, they were publishing it as accepted medical fact.
Medical journals actively promoted the belief that black people possessed a blunted nervous system.
The book quotes Dr. Charles White and Dr. James Johnson, who explicitly claimed that black people bore amputations and deep surgeries with the impunity of dogs and rabbits.
I want you to focus on that specific phrasing. The impunity of dogs and rabbits. It is doing massive psychological work.
It actively dehumanizes the subject, equating them with standard laboratory animals.
This racial ideology wasn't just a byproduct of bigotry. It was a necessary tool to protect careers.
It allowed doctors to perform excruciating repeated procedures, look at the blood on their hands, and still view themselves as heroic pioneers of science.
And here's the trap we cannot fall into. We cannot listen to the story of Sims and think, well, that was the 1840s. That was the Deep South under slavery. Of course it was barbaric.
Because the incentive architecture of this system didn't magically vanish when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed.
It just evolved. The incentives pushed these exact same practices well into the modern era, right up into elite northern academic institutions.
A perfect illustration of this persistence is the case of gastroenterologist William Osler Abbott.
Let's talk about Abbott, because this happens in 1935 at the University of Pennsylvania, an Ivy League institution.
The Abbott case strips away the excuse of antebellum slavery and shows us the everyday, mundane, bureaucratic nature of this exploitation.
Abbott was trying to develop an intestinal intubation device.
Let's explain this device because it sounds like a nightmare.
It essentially was a long rubber tube weighted at the end with a metal tip or a balloon.
Inserted through the patient's nose or mouth, down through the stomach, and threaded deep into the small intestine.
To study the digestive tract, extract fluids, or clear bowel obstructions, it was a massive potential breakthrough for gastroenterology.
But getting a 12-foot rubber tube to navigate the twists and turns of a living human's intestines is incredibly dangerous.
And to figure out how to do it, Abbott needed to be able to see where the tube was inside the body.
This meant he needed his test subjects to swallow this massive tube and then subject them to continuous massive doses of radiation through fluoroscopy live X-rays.
To track the tube's progress over hours or even days.
It was agonizing. The subjects would gag, vomit, risk bowel perforations, and soak up terrifying amounts of radiation.
When Abbott tried to recruit white laborers or medical students to test it, they completely refused. The risk and the pain were too high.
So, facing a roadblock to his discovery, Abbott relied on the system's standard operating procedure: find a vulnerable population.
He found a pool of poor black men in Philadelphia, and most notably, he utilized his own black janitor.
A man identified in the historical record only as Harry. He paid Harry and the other men 50 cents an hour.
50 cents an hour to undergo repeated, massive, unconsented radiation exposure. We have no record that Abbott ever explained the long-term, lethal risks of radiation to Harry.
He just needed the biological material to track his tube. And Abbott wasn't hiding this. He was giving speeches to other doctors at medical conferences presenting his findings.
And during these speeches, he casually referred to Harry and the other black subjects as his animals.
He made a joke to a room full of esteemed colleagues that his animals had a higher intake of corn liquor than the white rats in the medical school laboratories, but at least they were human so they could follow basic directions.
The room didn't gasp in horror. They probably chuckled, because the incentive architecture was perfectly aligned.
The incentive was a technological breakthrough, the Miller-Abbott tube, which would go on to save many lives.
The cost was Harry's unconsented, massive radiation exposure and dehumanization.
But because the system externalized the harm to a poor black janitor and internalized the scientific glory for the Ivy League doctor, the institution protected Abbott completely. It was viewed as a resounding success.
So if you have a system that operates like this, not for a few years, but for centuries, rewarding doctors for unconsented experimentation, what does that actually do?
What are the real-world results? This brings us to part 3, outcomes.
When we talk about outcomes, we must first acknowledge the visceral physical toll. Washington's text details an incredible litany of physical damage.
The pain, the disfigurement, the lethal injections of untested compounds, the stolen fertility.
The book spends significant time on what were colloquially known as Mississippi appendectomies.
Which is a deeply cynical term for a horrific practice. Let's explain what that actually meant.
A Mississippi appendectomy was the involuntary sterilization of young black women, predominantly in the South.
A woman would go into a teaching hospital for a routine procedure, maybe to actually get her appendix out or to give birth.
And the doctors would perform a hysterectomy or tie her tubes without her knowledge or consent.
Because the medical students needed practice performing gynecological surgeries, and these women's reproductive systems were deemed expendable.
They literally stole their ability to have children to provide a training module for a medical resident.
The physical toll is staggering, undeniable, and largely uncompensated.
But if we are maintaining our systems-level analysis, we have to transition to the most vital, predictable, and long-lasting social outcome of this architecture.
And that outcome is rational mistrust. The sources use a very specific word for this: iatrophobia.
Iatrophobia. From the Greek, iatros, meaning healer, and phobia, fear. The fear of the healer.
I want to spend some real time on this because how we define iatrophobia changes everything about how we view modern public health.
Usually when we hear the word phobia, we think of an irrational fear. Arachnophobia, you see a tiny house spider and you panic as if it's a tiger.
It's a miscalibration of risk.
Exactly. And the medical establishment frequently treats Black mistrust of medicine precisely like an irrational phobia.
They dismiss it as a cultural defect, an attitude problem, a lack of education, or mere paranoia.
You will hear mainstream discussions, even well-meaning public health campaigns, frame it as an irrational hurdle that marginalized communities just need to get over.
They say, we just need to educate them better so they trust the science.
But based on the historical record Washington provides, iatrophobia in this context is none of those things.
It is not a miscalibration of risk. It is a highly rational, learned risk model.
A learned risk model, that is the perfect way to conceptualize it. If you touch a red-hot stove and your hand gets severely burned, you do not develop an irrational stove phobia.
You develop a learned risk model about the dangers of hot metal. It is an empirical response to a lived experience.
The fear wasn't invented out of thin air. It was meticulously taught to these communities by the medical system itself.
And crucially, this learned risk model has been transmitted across generations. It moves through families and communities via oral histories.
When a grandmother tells her grandson a story about a specific county hospital where people from their neighborhood go in and don't come out,
or where women go in for a stomachache and come out unable to bear children, she's not spreading malicious conspiracy theories.
she is transmitting vital survival data based on a deeply ingrained historical reality.
And this leads us directly to the downstream outcomes. The present-day reality that you see in the news, in the data, in the horrific statistics about health inequality.
Because this rational mistrust interacts directly with modern ongoing bias to produce lethal outcomes.
Let's look at the data provided in the sources. The disparities are not marginal, they are vast. Black infant mortality is more than double that of white infants.
Black life expectancy is years lower overall. Conditions like cancer are consistently diagnosed at later, more lethal stages in Black patients.
The sources note a specific statistic that stopped me in my tracks. A Black woman is 2.2 times more likely to die of breast cancer than a white woman, despite having similar rates of mammogram screening.
So it's not just about access to the initial test, it's about what happens next.
If we synthesize these data points through our systems lens, a very clear, very damning picture emerges.
When mainstream media reports on these disparities, there is often an implicit framing that implies these gaps exist because of inherent biological flaws in Black bodies, or poor lifestyle choices.
Or they blame the iatrophobia directly. They just won't go to the doctor.
Exactly. But the systemic view shows us that these disparities compound because institutional memory, the learned risk model, is interacting with ongoing present-day systemic bias in the clinic.
Let's walk through what that interaction looks like in reality. A Black patient feels a lump or has severe pain.
But their learned risk model tells them that the hospital is a place of dismissal or experimentation or danger.
So, logically, they might delay seeking treatment until the pain is absolutely unbearable.
They delay to protect themselves. But when they finally do engage with the system, that delay means the cancer is more advanced.
And furthermore, studies continually show that even when they do present, they are systematically undertreated for pain.
Their symptoms are taken less seriously, and they are offered cutting-edge clinical trials at much lower rates than white patients.
So the system fails them in the past, causing them to delay. Then the system fails them in the present by dismissing their pain.
And then, when the outcome is tragic, who does the system blame?
The system blames the patient's culture. It points to their lack of compliance, their failure to seek early intervention.
Their refusal to participate in clinical trials. We offered them care, but they didn't trust us.
What the medical establishment systematically fails to acknowledge is its own foundational role in teaching those very communities to stay away.
The institution views the mistrust as the problem to be solved, rather than recognizing that the mistrust is a rational, predictable symptom of the system's own historical and ongoing behavior.
Okay, we need to ask the next logical question. If the outcomes are this glaring and the history is this brutal, how does a system like this survive?
How does it not collapse under the weight of its own ethical failures? That brings us to part 4, persistence.
We are going to look at the feedback loops and the institutional reinforcements that sustain this architecture across centuries.
A system, any complex system, requires constant maintenance to survive. It cannot just rely on inertia.
It sustains itself through very specific narrative and bureaucratic feedback loops designed to protect its prestige and ensure its continued operation.
The first and perhaps most powerful of these loops is the hero narrative.
Right. To maintain its authority, the medical system must aggressively sanitize its own history.
It has to separate the scientific triumph from the bloody mechanism of its creation.
And Washington provides a literal, visual example of this that is absolutely fascinating. She talks about a famous painting commissioned by the Parke-Davis Pharmaceutical Company.
It was part of a hugely popular series called A History of Medicine in Pictures, which was distributed to doctors' offices all over the country.
Millions of people have seen this image while waiting for a checkup. Paint the picture for the listener. What does it show?
The painting depicts J. Marion Sims operating on the enslaved woman, Betsy, but the painting is a complete, deliberate fiction.
It shows Betsy fully clothed in a clean dress, kneeling on a table, looking perfectly calm.
She is modestly holding her dress up slightly. Sims is standing back in a tailored suit, looking thoughtful and authoritative.
Flanked by a few attentive white colleagues, it looks like a polite consultation.
It completely erases the violent reality of the extraction.
Completely. It erases the physical restraint. It erases the fact that she was unanesthetized.
It erases the shrieks of pain that Sims himself documented in his own diaries.
It erases the fact that the other white doctors actually fled the shed because they couldn't stomach the horror of the screams and the blood.
Which meant Sims had to force the other enslaved women, Anarcha and Lucy, to physically hold Betsy down while he cut into her.
The painting takes a scene of absolute torture and turns it into a dignified moment of medical progress.
And that sanitization preserves the prestige of the pioneer and, by extension, the prestige of the entire medical profession.
It tells the public, trust us, our history is noble. But here's the detail that truly proves the system is actively maintaining this narrative today.
When Harriet Washington was writing Medical Apartheid, she wanted to include that specific painting in her book so she could visually analyze its inaccuracies for the reader.
The copyright for that painting is now held by Pfizer, the massive pharmaceutical corporation. So she asked Pfizer for permission to reproduce it.
And what was their response?
They didn't just say yes or no. They demanded to read her manuscript first.
They wanted to see the context in which she was going to place their asset.
Once Pfizer read the chapter and saw the critical, historical context she was providing, once they saw she was dismantling the hero narrative, they censored the image's use.
They formally refused her permission to print it.
The institution actively protects its prestige by controlling the historical record.
That is institutional reinforcement in action. The system protects its assets. Now let's look at another vital feedback loop: secrecy, complexity, and credential authority.
There is a persistent misconception that these medical abuses were the work of fringe lunatics, hiding in dark basements, keeping their crimes a secret.
But they weren't secrets at all. They were bragging about it.
Exactly. They were published openly, debated, and celebrated in the most dense, prestigious medical journals in the world.
Like the Journal of the American Medical Association or the New England Journal of Medicine.
So if it was published openly, why wasn't there public outrage?
Because of the shield of complexity and credential authority. These reports were shielded by impenetrable medical jargon.
They weren't written for the public.
Furthermore, before the internet, you couldn't just Google a medical study. You had to go to a specialized medical library. And those libraries often restricted access to credentialed professionals.
A layperson, especially a marginalized layperson, could not walk into a university library, pull the latest copy of JAMA, read the methodology, understand the jargon, and realize that their community was being exploited.
The system relied on the guild. Only those inside the guild could read, understand, and validate the work.
This effectively shielded researchers from public democratic scrutiny while allowing them to share their extracted data with their peers to secure their tenure.
And as we move the timeline forward into the modern era, the system has to adapt. It can't rely on literal chattel slavery anymore.
It can't just put an ad in the paper. So how does it get its subjects? It adapts its methods of control by simulating consent.
Simulating consent is a vital concept because after the Nuremberg Code and various modern medical ethics reforms, informed consent became the gold standard.
You have to sign a piece of paper saying you understand the risks.
So the system uses bureaucratic procedures to create the legal appearance of consent without actually achieving the ethical reality of it.
Let's talk about the emergency room loophole, because this is terrifying. The FDA allows exceptions to the rule of informed consent for trauma patients under certain life-or-death scenarios.
The logic on its surface seems ethically sound. If a person is brought into the ER unconscious, bleeding out from a car crash, they cannot sign a form.
The law argues that doctors shouldn't have to watch them die just because they can't consent, so doctors are allowed to try experimental life-saving treatments on them in the moment.
But in practice, when you apply this to the systemic architecture, it becomes a hunting ground.
Because where do these major trauma clinical trials take place? They take place in massive urban level 1 trauma centers.
Which means this exception disproportionately drafts vulnerable, heavily minority populations into non-consensual research.
The source material highlights the case of polyheme. Let's explain polyheme.
Polyheme was an experimental artificial blood substitute. The military was very interested in it for battlefield use, but it needed to be tested on civilians first.
So they utilized the FDA trauma exception. They tested it on unconscious people who were brought into urban ERs, people who had been shot or stabbed or in major accidents.
They just pumped this artificial blood into them instead of standard donor blood without ever asking them or their families.
And what were the results of that non-consensual trial? The early trials showed a 49% higher death rate compared to patients who received standard blood transfusions.
Patients also suffered significantly more heart attacks.
These people were drafted into a deadly experiment, given a substandard product, without ever being asked, simply because they had the misfortune of ending up unconscious in a specific urban trauma center.
That is simulated consent. The bureaucracy signed off on it, but the patient never did.
And another deeply troubling example of simulating consent involves targeting children.
The sources describe a study conducted in the 1990s by the New York State Psychiatric Institute and Columbia University.
Right. They were searching for a biological or genetic link to violent behavior. They wanted to see if they could predict which kids would grow up to be criminals based on brain chemistry.
To do this, they targeted young boys, primarily between the ages of 6 and 10, and they administered a drug called fenfluramine.
Fenfluramine is a cardiotoxic drug. That means it is known to cause damage to the valves of the heart.
It was actually half of the infamous fen-phen diet pill combination that was pulled from the market because it was destroying people's hearts.
They gave this heart-damaging drug to healthy little boys, and the protocol was incredibly specific about who they recruited. They actively excluded white children.
They exclusively targeted young Black and Hispanic boys, specifically Dominican boys from impoverished neighborhoods, usually the younger brothers of kids who had already been in trouble with the juvenile justice system.
How do they get consent for that? They exploit vulnerability under the guise of scientific authority. They approach desperate, under-resourced parents.
They offer a small stipend, maybe $100. They present complex, jargon-heavy consent forms.
They imply that participating might help their child avoid becoming a criminal. The parents sign the form, trusting the prestigious Columbia University doctors.
The system legally checks the consent box, effectively simulating consent for a dangerous experiment that targets a highly specific, marginalized demographic.
This leads to another crucial feedback loop that we have to acknowledge. The exploitation continues because it objectively benefits the system. The data generated is useful, and the techniques are profitable.
We have to re-examine the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study through the specific lens of systemic benefit.
Yes, because the standard narrative of Tuskegee is woefully incomplete. It is almost always portrayed merely as a tragic failure of ethics.
We are taught that doctors found a group of poor Black men in Alabama with syphilis, lied to them, withheld the cure when penicillin was discovered, and just passively observed them suffer and die over 40 years just to see what the disease would do.
A passive observation of disease progression. That's the story.
But the sources are clear. The Tuskegee study was not entirely passive. It was actively designed, in part, to generate profitable utility.
The U.S. government was trying to develop and refine reliable blood tests for syphilis tests that could be commercialized and used nationwide.
To calibrate those tests, they needed a constant, reliable supply of blood serum from people in various stages of untreated syphilis.
Wow, so they weren't just watching them die, they were using them as human reservoirs.
They used those men as a living, breathing supply chain of infected blood to perfect diagnostic tools.
The exploitation had a direct, tangible payoff for the institution and for public health infrastructure, completely at the expense of the men whose lives were destroyed.
And finally, the persistence of the system relies on one fundamental reality. Desperation breeds coercion.
Unequal access to quality healthcare creates a permanent structural pool of desperate subjects.
If you exist in a society where you have good insurance and a primary care doctor, you do not sign up to test a highly dangerous, unproven drug for $50.
Right. But if you exist in a society where you absolutely cannot afford standard medical care, where you don't have insurance, where the local clinic has been closed, you are highly susceptible to participating in a dangerous clinical trial.
Not for the noble pursuit of science, but simply because enrolling in the trial is the only way you can get a doctor to even look at you.
The system starves a population of basic care, creating the vulnerability, and then harvests that exact population for experimental data when they are desperate enough to submit.
Okay, we are seeing the architecture clearly now, but what does this all mean when we zoom out even further?
Let's move to Part 5, interconnection. This is where we look at the nested systems of power, because medical apartheid does not exist in a vacuum. It is not an isolated bug in the code.
It is deeply nested within and entirely symbiotic with larger historical and economic structures. If we trace the lineage, we must connect the medical system back to the origin point of slavery and racial caste formation.
Under slavery, as we discussed, black bodies were legally defined as capital. They were assets.
They were to be protected if they're producing labor, or they were material to be expended if it served the advancement of the owner or the state.
The medical system didn't invent that dynamic. It merely adopted that existing legal definition as a biological and ethical operating principle.
But here is the interconnection. That framework didn't vanish after emancipation. A system that requires vulnerable bodies for extraction will always find the next legally vulnerable population.
It just migrated its extraction methods into other institutions, specifically into the carceral state and the welfare system.
The book spends significant time on the Holmesburg prison experiments. Let's really look at what was happening there.
Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania, spanning from the 1950s into the 1970s. The medical director there, Dr. Albert Kligman, famously walked into the prison, looked at the inmates, and said, "All I saw before me were acres of skin." It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time.
Acres of skin. Again, the absolute dehumanization. These were disproportionately black men locked in cages.
And Kligman, working with major pharmaceutical companies like Johnson & Johnson and Dow Chemical, utilized this captive population for excruciating dermatological testing.
They applied experimental face creams, sure, but they also applied weaponized chemicals, dioxin, radioactive isotopes, and infectious diseases to the skin of these inmates.
They induced severe blistering, scarring, and systemic illness.
And the inmates submitted to this because they were in a completely coercive environment. They needed the tiny amounts of money offered to buy soap or commissary food, or they falsely believed participation might look favorable for parole.
The medical system fundamentally relies on the captive populations created by the carceral state. We also see this with wards of the state.
Children in juvenile facilities or orphanages were routinely subjected to experimental vaccine protocols or behavioral drug testing because they had no parents to advocate for them, and the state, acting as their guardian, readily offered them up as clinical material.
Furthermore, we have to nest this within the behemoth of biomedical capitalism. The modern pharmaceutical and medical device markets are multi-billion, perhaps trillion-dollar industries.
Their entire economic model fundamentally relies on the data extracted from human clinical trials. You cannot bring a drug to market without that data.
And historically, as we have seen from Sims to Abbott to Holmesburg, the intense, dangerous risks of those early Phase 1 and Phase 2 trials are disproportionately borne by marginalized bodies.
But the perfected, commercialized, safe treatments that result from those trials are disproportionately enjoyed by those with the wealth, the insurance, and the access to afford them.
The risk is socialized downward, but the benefit is privatized upward. And we are seeing this play out right now, not just historically, but on a global scale with modern public health governance.
The sources talk about a modern dynamic playing out in sub-Saharan Africa, which they refer to as a Hobson's choice.
Let's explain that idiom, a Hobson's choice. It means being offered a choice where only one option is actually viable. It's a take-it-or-leave-it scenario.
In clinical terms, it means you can either participate in an experimental, potentially dangerous drug trial, or you get absolutely no medical care at all. That is not a free choice. It is coercion by circumstance.
And why is this happening in Africa? Because U.S. and European researchers face incredibly strict FDA consent rules, massive bureaucracy, and intense public scrutiny when they try to run risky clinical trials at home.
The regulatory environment in the West, born out of past scandals, makes it very expensive and slow to test new drugs. So what do the pharmaceutical companies do?
They offshore the risk. They move the clinical trials to impoverished African nations, where the health infrastructure has either collapsed or never existed in the first place, and where regulatory oversight is weak or easily bypassed.
They show up in a village dealing with a meningitis outbreak, or HIV, and they exchange access to basic medical attention or access to an untried experimental treatment for access to legally and economically vulnerable bodies.
The researchers successfully bypass the stringent, expensive consent requirements of the FDA by exploiting the raw desperation of the Global South.
It's the exact same systemic dynamic of extraction finding an unprotected population to bear the risk of medical progress. It has simply been relocated geographically to avoid the gaze of Western regulators.
And this is exactly why treating a case like the Tuskegee syphilis study, or J. Marion Sims, as a standalone historical anomaly is so incredibly dangerous.
It distorts our entire understanding of how the world works. If we isolate Tuskegee, we tell ourselves a comforting lie. We tell ourselves that the problem was a few racist men in Alabama in the 1930s in a less enlightened time.
We tell ourselves that could never happen now. But when we look at the interconnections, when we connect the antebellum plantations to the Philadelphia prisons, to the urban ERs, to the African clinical trials, we see that Tuskegee is just one data point.
It's just one node in a vast, ongoing systemic pattern.
And that pattern is highly predictable. Systematic selection of a vulnerable population, an incentive payoff in data or profit for the institution, narrative protection through prestige and complex legal language, and the repeated generation of harm.
We have covered so much ground here. We have laid out the historical design of extraction. We've dissected the incentives that drove Sims and Abbott.
We've looked at the devastating outcomes, particularly the rational learned iatrophobia that drives modern health disparities.
We've seen how the system persists through simulated consent and hero narratives, and we've connected it to global capitalism and the carceral state.
So as we bring all of these threads together, I have to ask you the core question of this show. What is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis in perception operates on multiple intersecting levels, and we must dismantle it analytically. First, we must clarify what is fundamentally misperceived by the general public.
The dominant culture perceives Black mistrust of medicine as an irrational paranoia.
It perceives health disparities as a failure of individual choice, and it perceives historical abuses, like Tuskegee, as rare deviations perpetrated by rogue scientists.
That is the surface narrative we're all fed. Second, what structural layer is obscured by that misperception?
What is totally obscured is the incentive architecture of the entire medical system. We fail to perceive an architecture that actively, consistently, and historically rewards the extraction of data from vulnerable bodies.
We fail to see how that exact same architecture subsequently shields its institutions from accountability through the accumulation of prestige, the weaponization of bureaucratic procedure, and the control of PR narratives.
So why does our standard surface-level interpretation of medical history fail so completely? Why is it inadequate?
Surface interpretation fails because it treats these harms as individual failures of ethics. It looks for a villain with a scalpel.
But by focusing entirely on the individual morality of a single doctor, it completely fails to recognize these abuses as the highly predictable, virtually inevitable behavior of a system that is operating under conditions of extreme, unequal power dynamics.
When you have a medical system that demands human material for progress, and a broader society that legally and socially values some humans vastly less than others, extraction is not an anomaly.
It is the logical, expected output of the machine.
And finally, how does applying a systems-level analysis change what we can actually see?
By zooming out from the individual doctor and the individual patient, we can finally see the actual mechanics of the machine. We make the hidden dynamics legible.
We can clearly see how selection mechanisms actively target vulnerability, whether it's a slave cabin, a prison cell, or an impoverished village.
We can see how the benefits of medical research are allocated disproportionately upward to those with power and capital.
And we can see exactly how institutions reinforce this cycle, century after century, while avoiding culpability by blaming the very people they have harmed for their own rational mistrust.
Once you see the blueprint of the system, you cannot unsee it, and you can no longer accept the naive narrative of simple, unalloyed medical progress. You have to demand better architecture.
Before we close out, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. We've spent this entire deep dive talking about the historical extraction of medical data.
Right.
Well, today we are building massive machine learning and AI diagnostic tools, and we're training them on decades of historical medical data.
Data that was generated by this exact system.
Exactly. So if the foundational data inherently carries the biases, the delays in treatment, and the skewed outcomes of medical apartheid, what exactly are those algorithms learning to predict?
That is a terrifying question.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer link in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.